Well, recent shocking rape cases have outraged South Africans and again raised questions around whether there are actually any safe places for the country's women and children. But just a few of the 110 reported rapes that occur daily in South Africa make it into the public domain, and most cases are usually forgotten soon afterwards as the next horror story emerges to make headlines. Well, to discuss South Africa's alarming rape culture, we're joined by Wits University's Vetten and clinical psychologist Ruth. Ancer, ladies, good morning. And thanks for coming in. And I wish we actually didn't even have to talk about this, but I mean, what's happened in the weekend, what we saw happening to this little girl. Let's start with you, Lisa. I mean, rape, child abuse, sexual abuse, molestation, been happening for centuries. It really isn't anything new. A lot of the time, it's family members, it's grandparents, it's fathers, it's mothers. What takes this incident, this attack, to a different level, though?
I think it unfortunately plays into a very popular myth, is that children face bigger danger from strangers outside the home. And that is every parent's worst fear. This case hits all those buttons. And it does, as I think your intro was saying, help us make us forget, which we shouldn't do, that the greatest danger to children is those that they know. And that we just don't want to get upset about, because it starts to make us ask very uncomfortable questions about family members. It's much easier to project everything onto strangers, into the world out there, than to think about the people around me and the people I trust. And in some ways, I think because those are the more difficult cases, they're the ones we tend not to want to talk about unless there's very brutal injury involved, precisely because they are uncomfortable and raise these difficult questions.
And the brazenness of this attack, though. I mean,
it is
this
very
has
brazen.
taken it to a different level.
It is very brazen, which does raise questions about what was that. Was that individual high? What else was going on? Because it was a great risk they were taking.
And Ruth, just to talk about this, I mean, from what we hear, from what witnesses say, I mean, the case is in court now, so I mean, we'll hear more evidence as we go along. But that this seemed to have been premeditated. From what people say, he was sitting and watching this child, and even the video, I don't know if you've actually seen what's come out over the past 24 hours or so, what we've seen the video, him being confronted in the bathroom and all of that, a person, I mean, again, we can't name him, just what you see of this person and what we gather, I mean, 21 years old, you know, what is the makeup of such a person? Can we even, many people saying possibly that he was a victim also, this could have happened to him as a child. What do you, at first glance of the story, glean about the suspect in this case?
Okay, so it's very important that I say, we don't know anything about the suspect apart from what's come out on social media. So it's incredibly hard to make definitive comments about what was going on. What I can say in general is that it isn't uncommon for predators to premeditate in terms of who might be a vulnerable victim. What does, in this case, seem, as Lisa mentioned, normally there was very little attempt to minimize risk in terms of him being found out, which does raise questions. Yes. You know, was there anything? Was there psychosis?
Well, he was found with drugs in his possession, as far as we know as well.
So there might have been an altered sense of reality and risk, because that is unusual. So there are a lot of questions because we don't know exactly what's going on. But essentially, I think what Lisa said is so important. What has happened with this case is that it really highlights a lot of our fears, but also the myths, because it is just so out there that you have an idea that we can protect children. If we love them enough and watch them enough, we can protect them from bad things happening. We can't. And I think that that's
not
what
all the time. Yeah.
Yes, that's what taps into people's fears, because generally the brutality and the publicness of this is what really hits us. But essentially, this is happening to children silently and invisibly, every day, all day, by people they trust and care about, and people we wouldn't suspect.
And I think, Lisa, you know, in this case also, this has sort of put so many parents now on tenterhooks about where do we go? What do we do? Can our children, it's one thing, we were never able to let them play outside the house. Now we take them, we go with them to a certain place, and even then they might not be safe. And also the culture of just handing our children over to strangers who are childminders, who are supposed to be watching our children for a tip or for a fee or for a salary. Is that just not, you know, sort of a bit misguided, that we just think we can hand our child over to someone and that they will be safe because this person's paid to look after them?
Look, whenever you put your child in somebody else's care, it is important to know a little bit about that person, whether they're trustworthy. And if your child is in formal care, you need to know whether or not the nursery school or the school or whatever facility it is has checked the child's background against the National Sex Offenders Register. But that will only protect us so far. And I mean, I think, again, we hope that there is some special sign that will mark somebody out as a child rapist. They'll have a cross on their forehead. That is not the case. And I think, to pick up on something that Ruth was saying, one of the hardest things to accept is that you cannot protect your child all the time, constantly. You can do the best you can, but unfortunately, the world is beyond our control. And I sometimes think we shouldn't make parents feel as if it is their fault or that they should have done something differently, because there's an enormous amount of guilt attached to something like this, I would imagine. And in suggesting that there was something that could have been done, you know, unnecessarily aggravates that guilt. I think we should strike a careful balance between obviously putting responsibilities on people to look after children, but to also understand that sometimes things are beyond their control. And how can we support a parent who has gone through something so appalling?
Yeah. Well, and it's an entire family.
Yes.
And I'm assuming an entire community. I mean, it's extended families, all of these that have been affected by this case. And I think, Ruth, I mean, we also want to raise independent children. We can't be, I mean, we've been told for years, don't be a helicopter parent, let them find out things. How do you do that when stuff like this happens?
So I think, to reinforce again what Lisa said, is we can minimize risk. We cannot eliminate risk. Even if you're holding your child's hand 24 hours of the day, which would be very unhealthy, something could fall on your child's head. And I think to say that you'll never let your child out of your sight is physically impossible, but also what kind of child will you raise? This is shocking what happened, and it's devastating. But generally, children, we have to allow children to also develop independence. And it's about getting that balance. But part of it is about accepting that there are things that we cannot control. And what we can do is we can provide support and guidance and talk to our children about what is okay, how to keep themselves safer. But there are things that we cannot control. And I think that is what's so hard as a parent.
It is hard. And like you say, I mean, when it does happen, what do we do? Okay, so how do we deal with this? I mean, this is a 6-year-old. She's going to remember what happened. And I think she knows what's happened. She's old enough to understand what's happened, I think.
We must, yes, absolutely. But we must realize that the child and the parents and the family need support. They need medical support. They need psychological support. They need a lot of support and guidance. However, it is incredibly vital that we don't put blame onto parents in a situation like this when they already are torn apart by what's happened. I've seen so much in social media. Where were the parents? Why weren't they watching? And I think that's our way of trying to say that won't happen to us because I will watch more carefully. But it is not helpful, it's not constructive, and it's not realistic.
Yeah, it's happened. It's happened now, so we have to move forward and see.
It has happened. And I do think that it is our way of trying to protect ourselves from the sense that we are not all powerful and we cannot protect our children from everything bad that's going to happen. But and also it's something to consider is that while this is an exceptional trauma, it doesn't need to define every moment of this child and this family's life. There are people who go through very horrific situations and are able to be resourceful and resilient, and it really just does depend on how much meaning can be made without taking away from the horror and trauma. But we also don't know how people are going to respond in the future, and that's why they need intervention and support to help them navigate the trauma of this.
And to do it the right way and do right by this child. And Lisa, I think also coming out of this is also the conversations we have with our children about how they view adults. I mean, we're always teaching our children in the past, you know, growing up traditionally, you always have to respect every adult, do what every adult tells you to do. If that uncle wants to give you a kiss goodbye, you scold her, how could you not give him a hug? Go and sit on so-and-so uncle's lap or your grandpa's lap. And you know what, the time has changed. We can't actually, and I think that's a conversation we need to have also. If your child says, but mommy, I don't want to sit on Uncle so-and-so's lap, you've got to start to listen.
Absolutely, and you know, it's important that one respects children's bodily space, their boundaries, all those sorts of things, that one teaches them things like the differences between good touch and bad touch, and if they are uncomfortable or they're worried about what is happening, is to go and tell you. But I often think we forget about children who don't live in very good home circumstances, who are vulnerable, who are in situations where
and
adults
can't leave those situations.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think we need to also be thinking about how do we identify and support those children at school, because often those children are targeted because they are vulnerable. So I think it's also looking at not just our children, but how do we create communities that are safer for children much more generally? How do we look after those children who perhaps are isolated, who are lonely, who don't have friends and who don't have parents? So I think it's not just about our responsibility to our children, but to children more broadly.
And I think that it also comes down to that age-old discussion about what do we do as punishment for the offenders? How do we punish them? How do we make it something that you don't actually want to look in a child's direction if you have a sudden urge? I mean, we had discussions about the death penalty recently as well, certain political parties calling for that. I mean, I'd like your take on that, Ruth.
Well, I think that we've had the death penalty in the past and it certainly didn't do anything to decrease the amount of child abuse. And I think we have to also differentiate between, there are people that, who have attractions to prepubescent children who don't necessarily act on it. When there is this kind of brutality, we're often looking at a psychopathy as well, where there isn't a sense of empathy. And it's very difficult because there's so few convictions that psychopaths who have no empathy have a sense that they'll get away with it. And I don't believe that there is a specific punishment.
They're not thinking that they'll get caught when this happens.
I think it's a culture.
When they're
I think it's
a
cultural. I think there's a sense of seeing children and other people, not just women, as sexual objects. And I think it's about power and control and violence.
And Lisa, just a last word from you. Have we run out of ways to protect our women and children? Have we? Are we not thinking far enough?
You know, we talk an enormous amount. And as somebody who's done this for 20 years, I am so tired of the enormous amount of talking, the enormous amount of outrage, but we never actually follow through. We seem to think that talking is that if we've spoken about it, we've taken action. And that's what I would like to challenge people to do, is keep your attention on this problem for longer than 3 minutes so that we can actually implement some useful things. Also, these things take time to address. Do not expect solutions immediately. And very importantly, put money into services. Our child protection systems in South Africa are on the point of collapse. In parts of the country, they practically don't exist. Put money into those services in order to protect children. Don't just get outraged.
Thanks very much, Lisa Vetten, Ruth Ancer, for just that insight into this horrific incident, this horrific attack on this child, and just what we as a community should and can be doing